I'm Dr. Jo Bichell. I'm excited to be here today conducting interviews for Angelman Updates. This is a joint production of the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics and the Angelman Syndrome Foundation to bring to our families researchers and clinicians who are making the biggest impact on the field of Angelman syndrome. And because I am the parent of an adult son with Angelman syndrome and a neuroscientist, these interviews are really fun for me because I get to ask questions I've always wanted to ask of the researchers I've always been fascinated with and present them to you. So today we have Dr. Christy Zigler, who is a researcher at Duke University on a team with Dr. Bryce Reeve. And her research there has been to produce something called the ORCA, which is a measure of communication abilities in children and people with Angelman syndrome. So I'd like to present Dr. Zigler, and we can get to know her a little bit and know her research. So if you could please introduce yourself and just tell us a little bit about your background and a little bit about what you're doing now.
Yes, so I am Christy Zigler. I am an assistant professor at Duke University in the School of Medicine. And so I sit in the Department of Population Health Sciences, and I'm one of the core faculty members for the Center for Health Measurement. And so background-wise, I'm a statistician and psychometrician by training. So I got my PhD at the University of Pittsburgh in the School of Education. And while I was there, I was working as a clinical research coordinator for a pediatric rheumatologist. And I really fell in love with health measurement. And applying the skills that I was learning in my PhD program to problems that I was seeing in clinic. And so, my dissertation work focused on pediatric localized scleroderma, which is a rare condition. And there were no patient-reported outcome measures that were currently available that had input from patients and families. And so that was really where I fell in love with working. I don't know if we need to, let me turn this sound off, sorry. And that's really where I fell in love working with, in pediatric health measurement and with communities who are experiencing, rare diseases.
So that's really interesting. And first off, the question I have is, what is psychometrics? You said you're a psychometrician. What does that mean?
Great question. So psychometrics is the study of testing and measurement. And so, if you've thought about or heard about like reliability and validity, so it's developing measures and assessing measures to ensure that they have adequate properties so that when we give somebody a measure, we're actually assessing what we hope we are.
So the psychometrics is, just to rephrase it, a way of studying whether a test is any good.
Yes.
That's basically it. Okay. So, and so before you were measuring pediatric scleroderma, and now you're doing something with Angelman syndrome. What is it that you're working on?
Yeah, so right now we're working on the observer-reported measure of communication ability, which is termed the ORCA. And this project has been one of the most rewarding that I've ever worked on. And we're really looking at communication ability from the perspective of the families and the parents. And what are the pieces of communication that matter to families, that impact their quality of life, that they care about. And that's what we built into the ORCA measure.
So right now you're studying a measure of communication abilities to see if it's any good. So that's what that means when you say psychometric. So but also, didn't you also create the measure?
Yes, so there's two pieces, right? Our typical measurement development process involves a lot of formative qualitative work. So if we know that we need to develop a new measure, we start by talking to families, right? We we perform what we call a concept elicitation study, where we sit down with the stakeholders, in this case, caregivers of children and adults who have Angelman syndrome, and we ask them about their daily life. And we dive deep into that qualitative data to get a really good understanding of what their experiences is with communication ability. And then we use that to build a conceptual framework, and we use the conceptual framework to draft the measure. So we have formative qualitative work that the measurement kind of stands on, and then we use advanced statistical methods to make sure that when we're using the score based off of the measure, that score is interpretable and valid and reliable. So that's how the two pieces together. So even though I'm quantitatively trained, statistics and psychometrics deal with math and numbers, the qualitative data is actually, I think, more important to developing and evaluating measures that are family-centered, patient-centered.
Okay, so just to see if I get it, what you're doing is interviewing families and asking them questions like, how does your kid communicate? Or how do you know what your child needs? Or how do you know if your child is in pain, or something like that? So you're asking questions about communication that are very open-ended from the family. And that's what you call the concept elicitation phase, right? And
That's
then
exactly right.
Okay, and then you take those ideas, and then so you're going to ask you did ask a whole bunch of different families those questions. And then after that, you had a long list of ideas and struggles that families have gone through and successes that they've had and things like that. And then you put that into a survey. Is that how it works?
Yes. Then we use all that information to draft questions to ask families that will allow us to assess the child's communication ability, but we're using language and the experiences that we get from families. So it's not us deciding what to ask and how to ask it. It's really the families telling us what to ask and how to ask it.
And so you did this already for Angelman syndrome. That's how you created or drafted the ORCA. So and you'd already worked with these kids with pediatric scleroderma. So were you surprised by what you found with the Angelman? I mean, what were some of the things that the Angelman families said to you that you hadn't expected?
Oh, that's a great question. I think, when I'm doing qualitative work, I'm always surprised when I talk to patients. And I think that just shows the value of doing that formative, gut check with the people that, we're hoping to help with the resulting measure, right? And so for this project, what I think was so interesting is that existing measures, individuals with Angelman commonly scored at the floor. And so families would tell us that sometimes their child didn't even get a score, right? They're they're lower than the average score on the measure, right? So they're, and that mattered to families, right? Like their child wasn't even captured, their experience wasn't even captured in the measure. And so that was something when we were developing the ORCA, we wanted to pay close attention to. We wanted to make sure that everyone's experience was going to be captured in the measure. Everyone would be able to answer some of the questions as, yes, my child can do this or does this, right? And I think what also was surprising, at least to me, is how much caregivers could talk about communication with their child. Like there's a lot going on there that was just missing from, some of those existing measures.
That's fantastic, because we Angelman families, we know what our kids are trying to tell. I mean, some things we don't know, which is why we want communication improved. Like it's really hard for us to know when our kids are in pain, where that pain is coming from, or what's exactly going on with them, what are they afraid of, all those things. How old are your kids?
I have kids. Two girls. My oldest is 4 and my youngest is about 1.5.
So you had that baby, the youngest, when you were in the middle of doing all this ORCA work.
I did. Yes. I was, we were doing qualitative interviews and I'm on the phone, yeah. So I think being a mother and understanding, how important communication is with my own kids, that added additional meaning, I think, to this project and motivation to get this right, to do it right.
And also, I think when you have a little baby learning language and growing, and you really can pay attention to all those teeny little gains that a baby or a toddler makes. And you know what your baby is trying to tell you most of the
Mm-hmm.
time, not all the
Mm-hmm.
time, but and so that could also probably really help you appreciate all the gains that we're working on, that the Angelman families are working on.
Oh, yeah.
So, okay, so you have a PhD in education?
Yes.
That,
So it's technically in research methods, but it's from the School of Education. Yes.
oh, and then, but it sounds also kind of like anthropology.
My master's is actually in counseling psychology. And so, when I was doing my master's, I loved the psychology and thinking about how people interact. And, but then I realized that I didn't want to be an actual therapist. Sitting in a room with somebody wasn't where my passion lied. So I had wonderful mentors who steered me toward the research side of things. So,
And then,
and I still use some of those skills about, especially with qualitative methods and interviewing and all of that. So the master, even though I'm not, practicing psychologist, I think my master's was helpful.
and then you must do a lot of statistics. You must
Yeah,
love math.
I do. And if you'd asked me in high school, math, that's definitely not where I want to go. But I think what I really like about statistics is the math is a tool to answer really important questions and to get information that will actually help people. And so that application to math, I think, really resonated with me.
So that's a good last ending for our interview. Basically, what you're doing is, with the ORCA, is finding out what patients' lives are really like and figuring out how to measure whether kids get better if they get treated with a medication, and
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
using math to double check whether the way you measured it is any good or not.
Yes.
Right? And then so that's your job. That's cool.
Yeah, it's really cool.
So
I love.
what is it that you're going to do with the ORCA after this?
Yeah. So
Did it for Angelman, now what? Sorry.
yes. So the Foundation for Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics funded the original development work of the ORCA, and so we recently, used that as a platform to help expand the ORCA to other neurodevelopmental disorders. And so we've been recently funded by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to perform that work. So right now we're starting up qualitative interviews with parents whose children have other severe communication impacts, and we're going to talk with them to see how much of the ORCA content fits their experiences and where we need to potentially expand the content.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Zigler. You are amazing. You obviously care a lot for our families and the children, and you are smart as a whip, and I'm so happy you're working on it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here, and I'm very grateful because my job wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the generous donations of time from families. Like I need families to talk to me, and that I know that's a gift that they want to talk and share their experiences and share their time. So I'm very appreciative to be working in this research space.
Thank you. So now wait, I want to ask you a couple more questions. I wanted to end it like that so she can edit it.
Okay.
But then I wanted to ask you another thing. So I want to ask you, okay, here we go. Okay. So the ORCA that you've been working on is a communication measure. Why did you decide to work on a measure of communication in Angelman syndrome? Why not motor skills or anxiety?
Yeah, that's a great question. And communication was really brought to us by FAST because it was a high priority for families, right? Families repeatedly said, this is important to us. And in the context of a clinical trial, communication is one of those domains that would be really meaningful if we could see improvements in communication. So, that is really where we started. What communication is important to families, and how can we measure this in a way that truly reflects their experience, and how can we plug this into drug development so that if we see gains in communication, we're capturing that so the drug can be approved, right?
And so when you're measuring communication, are you only measuring iPad use or, AAC devices, or what are you taking into consideration?
Yeah, another great question. And so what we heard from families in our interviews was that modality was really important, and it varied. Some individuals used gestures or modified gestures. Some individuals used assistive devices, either high tech or low tech. Some families used, sounds and body language, and some all of the above, right? And so I think that making sure that somebody who communicates a specific message using one modality was getting the same credit as somebody who is communicating the same message using another modality. And also understanding that verbal speech and even use of assistive technology is more universally understood by people outside of the family. And so having some additional value placed on that, or additional weight, I think is a better term, in the measure for when individuals were hitting those milestones. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what if a kid takes a medication in a study, and before they were using an assistive communication device, and now they're not using the iPad as much, but they're starting to use signs, or maybe even try to verbalize? Is the ORCA going to be able to pick that up?
That's another really great question, right? And so right now, what we're focusing on in Angelman syndrome with the ORCA measure is, are those changes and the meaningful change, and can we capture those important things that are happening? And so that's actually ongoing work, is that responsiveness of the measure. It does a good job catching a snapshot of communication ability, and it was designed so that we could see those pre-post changes. But we're working right now to make sure that our expectation is correct, that if there are meaningful changes happening, we're going to see them come up in the score.
And I guess the most, if this is the thing that's most important to families, communication, if we see an improvement in communication in a clinical trial, that could make or break that drug. That could help that drug pass and get FDA approval or not. So in fact, all this is riding on you, Dr. Zigler.
And I think that's a really important, I don't take that lightly, and making sure we have the right evidence and we fully understand what this measure does and what this measure doesn't do, and how we should be using it in clinical trials. We have rigorous plans and methods so that we feel confident that when this is ready to be a primary or secondary endpoint, we feel really good about how its performance.
You've been working on the ORCA for Angelman syndrome, and it's kind of done. You've really you created it, you measured it, now you're measuring to see if it's a good measurement. That's the psychometrics part, right? Now what are you going to do with the ORCA?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we were funded by FAST to develop the ORCA measure. And so we went through the stages of measurement development, we piloted it with families so we could see how it worked. We have performed some statistical testing. So there's some ongoing work that we're still doing in the Angelman community, looking at the relationship of the ORCA and other commonly used measures of communication. We're also looking at responsiveness over time. But what I think is really exciting is that we've used the foundational work that was funded by FAST to jump into expansion of the ORCA measure for individuals with other neurodevelopmental disorders that also severely impact communication ability. So I'm really excited to be partnering with Combined Brain, which is a patient advocacy consortium, so that we can plug into families and other researchers who are doing work in these other conditions that also have similar communication impacts. So we're expecting that we're going to be confirming to see if their experiences are reflected in the ORCA measure, and if there are gaps, we're going to build up those gaps so that the ORCA can be used for clinical trials across the board in other conditions as well.
That's fantastic. So thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Again, I appreciate you, and I will be seeing you very soon, I'm sure.
Sounds great.
All right. Bye.
Bye.